better to do. It's a beautiful day outside. It's nice and breezy. I don't know if you can, oh yeah, you can see those clouds, those beautiful clouds. It's a really great day. I'm out here with my little buddy, as usual, Balboa Jr. Uh, let's wait and see at least one person come on by. But hopefully look at those clouds. Holy shit. Alright, stuff to talk about. Obviously, the Zizek Peterson debate happened yesterday. I didn't pay for it. I wouldn't pay for it, even if I had lived there. Mainly because my friends and I already had the clear impression of what it would be like. And it was pretty much like what we thought. But there was something that was rather unexpected. There was agreement to a good extent, at least explicitly. Implicitly, there was much disagreement, but you know, it's not worth really harping on about that particular difference. I mean, we all were aware of that anyways. That Zizek is a seasoned philosopher, and Peterson is not. Zizek is by and far more widely read into things generally than Peterson is. Zizek knows a hell of a lot more about economics, knows a hell of a lot more about sociology, really, than Peterson does. And so, was it really a surprise that Zizek would own Peterson in the sense that he would just stump him with some things and Peterson would just be left gawking, nothing to say? Well, no, not really. We all knew that. Hey there, viewer. Just rambling a bit here about the Jordan Peterson and Zizek debate. Don't know if you can see these. No, can you? Is it focusing? Can it focus? Okay, you can't see it very well, but the clouds are very nice. But anyways, the interesting thing was that the Jordan Peterson and Zizek thing was not much of a debate. It was highlighted as a debate, and I didn't watch the entire thing. I wasn't going to bother watching it until somebody linked it to me, and I went ahead and watched it on a restream on YouTube. And I think I went somewhere about after a third of the debate was done, so I watched only about the last 2/3. And apparently the first third was exactly what everybody had expected. It's the second and, the last 2/3 that really got to a point where I think most people don't know what happened. In that most people don't realize that what began as debate was immediately turned by Zizek into a dialogue. And that was interesting. It was, one could say, amazing, in that it wasn't expected. Nobody really expected this. People thought it would be a here's my position, no, you're wrong, here's my position, and rather, part of it was expected in that all my friends and I knew that Zizek would be of the kind of, I agree with you, but he does it a lot with people who are against him. He'll bring up points of agreement in order to try to get under them, so to say, and bring forth some modicum of unified, intelligible ground to the discussion. And look at those clouds. It's really amazing clouds. I should get myself one of those silly little selfie sticks or something. One's arms get tired holding things this way. Hey Dan, you're the first one to pop in here. Been rambling about the Peterson debate. I didn't watch the whole thing really. I only watched about the last 2/3. So the point that I went in, I think, was at the point where the debate turned into a dialogue, because I read what other people said about the beginning of it, and how Peterson came in all guns blazing to a typical standard debate that he was used to, even though he knew he was going against this intellectual titan named Zizek. And that I came in somewhere in the middle of Zizek's response, and that turned out to be immediately diffusing, in which the question of, well, what are we even talking about, came up. No, you're just at the beginning, douchebag. You got here just at the beginning. So anyways, I think that it's pretty important. I think that that was a really important little moment about how the fact that Zizek actually tried to talk to Peterson showed an immense amount of mastery from Zizek's side. I mean, like, the other autist philosopher that I know of, whom I've mentioned sometimes, Daniel Pascal Zorn, this guy, logic head, into reflexive logic, Platonic dialogue and dialectic. And he wrote a short post, and he's like, this was a masterful display of dialectic right here. About how there was an actual dialogue that went on. So besides that, there's nothing much to say about it. I mean, Peterson was wrong in the ways that we thought he would be wrong. Zizek did the usual, like, I agree with you, but I think like the real victory there, which hardly anyone sees, unfortunately, is precisely that dialogue that happened, where I think Zizek might have penetrated a little bit into Peterson's skull, and so going down the future, you might see some little tinges of the stuff that was talked about in that debate coming up from Peterson himself. For example, like, I don't know if you watched, how far you watched, but like when Zizek mentioned the whole like Christ on the cross as atheism, like Peterson's brain was just going like, mind was blown. Even though I've heard that for oh god, probably close to around like 7 years now since I first heard it, but it's a good analysis. It's a good one. What did they talk about generally? Nothing really interesting, to be honest. The topic of the debate was happiness. Peterson came in with some typical tripe about, the Communist Manifesto, and communism is completely false. It's never worked, it's not true, hierarchies, whatnot. And Zizek apparently just very quickly like dispensed with that. Well, like, nobody cares about the Communist Manifesto. What are you talking about? The real stuff is in the capital. And then just starts finding common ground with Peterson to try to calm him down and diffuse the situation, and start trying to penetrate his thick skull that the leftist he talks about, particularly about the Marxist, the liberal, postmodernist, neo-Marxist conspiracy theory he peddles. And I think Zizek, in literally just being Zizek, brought that down like before Peterson's face. And Peterson had no response to that other than saying, you know what, I can't disagree with you, but I'll still try to push this whole thing of like, well, even if what you say about Marxism is true, there's so much baggage to it that why are you calling yourself a Marxist? Why don't you call yourself Zizekian? Yeah, he mentioned the toilet jokes and the whole Jesus on the cross and ideology, and Peterson was on the back end for the entire thing, really, in which like he had nothing he could critique it Zizek on. Like, he just had to say, I agree with you, but I still don't want to like accept that this Marxist stuff is true. And that's really how it all ended. It seemed to me that were Peterson and were Zizek, to be like drinking buddies or something, back in the 1800s or even today, that they would have these discussions at a fucking pub. Um, and if anybody was going to bend to somebody's position, it would be Peterson to Zizek, because Peterson realized in that conversation that he was out of his league and he knew he was wrong. So that's quite something. So, insofar as Zizek managed to penetrate into Peterson and hopefully, Peterson's base, to reveal the lacks. Yeah. People joked about that because Peterson has no idea who Hegel is or anybody. But either way, I think most people saw it in the wrong light. They saw this of like, oh my god, Zizek stomped Peterson. Well, we all know that doesn't really work. That's not how debates really end up. That it's not about like you told the truth and the other person got exposed. It's rather about managing communication, really. So the success was the communication that was managed, not really that Zizek said things that are true, which we agree with. And we go, haha, our side won, you guys got stomped. Yeah, Doug's an idiot. I'm sorry. Like, what else can be said? Doug Lane is not. But anyways, moving on. There's not much to say about the debate. What else? I finished up my outline blog on at least the first half. It's actually just like the first fourth of the book, but it's the first section of 2 sections of the book, Being an Oil. I posted that on Twitter. If you're interested, check it out. Or rather, let me be more clear. Go read it, please, because I think the points that Chad brings up are actually pretty interesting and important. Stuff that I wasn't aware about, particularly stuff about peak oil. One may disagree with. One may disagree with Chad's methodology and his concepts. I certainly don't fully agree. But the stuff he brought up about the dynamics about how our societies is highly founded on oil, that most of what we have from material to ideology is only possible because of oil. That's not just interesting. It's important to realize that if indeed the crisis of peak oil is real, we need to come to terms with that. It's the logic of limitation, that the world as we know it will end, and there will be parts of it which will not be retrievable no matter what we do, simply because cheap energy is going to be gone, and ways of life are going to be gone, which allow for certain ways of thinking, ideologies, which are pretty heinous today, but they wouldn't have any purchase in a future time. So check out that article, and if you find it interesting, buy Chad's book. It's only $4. Support the guy. He calls his style of philosophy Cimmerian philosophizing. I didn't know this because I'm not a fan of Conan the Barbarian, but Cimmeria is the land of Conan the Barbarian, and so it's this philosophy out in the wilderness sort of thing. It's interesting. Beyond that, somebody in the comments to one of my other videos asked me about what do I think about desire, logical desire, and Hegel. They asked me if I had read Judith Butler's book on it. My answer is no. Am I going to read it? Chances is no. Mainly because most of what I've heard about Butler is honestly that she's not very deep. She's one of those people who has verbosity. Unfortunately, it's the continental style. But that's exactly the kind of shit that I hate, and I don't want to bother with that. Not only that, there's this already Hegelians who have worked out this to stupid amounts of degrees. There's pure Hegelians like I think it's Peter Kalkovich wrote a book on the phenomenology of spirit called The Logic of Desire, reading the entire phenomenology through the chapter 4 concept of desire and recognition, those kinds of things. There's Zizek. Zizek's a lot about desire. Mind you, Zizek also is a terrible writer. I've I'm not too interested in him, but friends of mine who have started. I've listened in on their readings and followed along with PDFs and stuff reads like the stuff which I despise. It's academic-y. It's chock full of references to this person, that person. It's academically self-masturbatory in that way. It's not clear and get to the point, which I like. I'm not inclined to read those kinds of works. I think that philosophers do need to do their effort, their part to make their shit readable. If you don't make your shit readable, I can't be asked to be reading it. Logic of desire, or rather, the reality of desire, is important. And it's important for various things. I've talked about it in a bit. The main thing I've written about it is my article on Epichet about love and recognition, and that function of desire, and how that ends up constituting the self. The other major thing that I've said about that is concerning self-consciousness, about how in the phenomenology of spirit, Hegel gets into this whole thing about recognition first arises, or rather self-consciousness as recognition first arises in that moment where desire desires desire. It's kind of a mouthful. It's one of my favorite sentences in English. It's you use the same word 3 times. Desire desires desire, or rather 4 times. And it's a fully intelligible sentence. It has a subject, an object, and it has a verb. And it's all one word. Come on. So what's important about desire? Well, Hegel's readable. Believe me. The only time he's not readable is when you start with the shit people tell you to start with, like the philosophy of history. If you read that, I can fully understand why you don't think he's readable. Because those things are assuming a lot about what you know. And I still get... It confuses me how people can suggest that you start with, either the philosophy of art, or the philosophy of history, or philosophy of religion, or any of those things with Hegel. Because the best you're going to get there is a very vague notion about what the hell is going on. You're going to catch snippets quite a few places where you're going to have an aha moment of like, holy shit, I get this. But you won't understand why you get it, and you won't understand what the hell this has in relation to do with everything else. Whereas if you start with somewhere like the science of logic, you're not going to have that problem very much. I can guarantee you that. I tell you that from experience. But then again, I admit I'm an autist in the sense that I'm obsessive, so I put in the work to bother figuring it out. That you could possibly just open it up and read it. It's like, oh yeah, it's clear as day. No, it won't be. But that's the nature of philosophical reading anyways. You got to work at it. If not, it just doesn't sink that deep, and you recognize that it's not that deep. Because I read secondary literature, for example, and I can read it like that. pretty quickly. I don't have to slow down. I don't have to go and like take too many notes because what is being said is rather clear, but it's clear in a way that is not interesting, and it doesn't engage you. Whereas the clarity of somebody like Hegel or Aristotle or Plato is a clarity that makes you work. And once you've done the work, you realize, holy shit, there was no other way to say this, essentially. But it makes perfect sense. So anyways, desire. First important function of desire is it's the basis of self-consciousness. And self-consciousness is massively important. Desire is therefore massively important. If you're a living being and you don't desire, you're gonna die. It's simple as that. One could probably say that plants and all these other things must have desire in a way. Because desire is not necessarily a reflective, self-reflective kind of thing. You don't have to be aware to be desiring. One can desire without really being aware of it. That one's kind of with plants is weirder. Desire defined as being human. I would say so. It's part of the definition of what it is to be human. That if you don't desire, you don't do anything. I mean, like we do things because we desire. We live lives because we desire. We do all the great things that we do, all the terrible things that we do, because we desire. And when we have lost the drive of desire, you die. You vegetate. You enter the nihilist phase of why am I living, and then you're kind of confused. How do I get that spark back? How do I desire to live again? And it's a misnomer, right? I mean, tell me if this doesn't make sense to you. That to say that I desire to live is really a strange thing to say, because desire is life. If you didn't desire things, you wouldn't be doing things. Life is that movement. Even the desire to kill yourself or something like that. It's a drive of life. What's wrong? Are you hot? You want to go someplace else? Yeah. Here's the doggo. I actually took him to the vet this morning for the first time ever, actually. He has these little things on his belly that I was kind of a bit worried about, so I just took him to the vet to get him a general checkup and see if he was okay. And well, the vet just said he's fat, and obviously he's getting a bit old, and so he's already got arthritis, a small bit of arthritis, and so they just told me, well, you need to get him on losing weight. I asked them what I could do, and they're like, well, you can either change him to, if he's already eating very little, which I mean, a cup and a half for his size isn't a lot. They told me that I should try either changing him to wet dog food, because that doesn't have grains, it's mostly protein, it's less calories actually. Or they also suggested me this other dog food, literally called fat dogs. And I looked it up online, and it's not that expensive actually. It's not grain. It's not made of grain. It's mostly fiber. To fill them up, and that should help him lose weight and help with that arthritis, because he lays down and he gets up nowadays, and especially in the winter, with the cold it gets worse. Where his little joints hurt for a couple of steps before he starts walking fine again. So I want him to be at his best. He came to me when he was fat, like 3 years ago, so it's not my fault, but I've been trying to make him lose weight. Walking him for an hour and feeding him less has not been enough. He's only gotten down to about 45 at the minimum, and for a dog his size, he should be somewhere in the 20-pound range. So that's a story about Balboa right there. But yeah, anyways, so desire. Uh, there's something in the phenomenology. It's not so clear. Apparently, in the philosophy of spirit is where this is actually clear of why it is that self-consciousness arises. Um, that's one way. I have the fragments of Heraclitus. I read through about like a third of them. Uh, like most of them don't make sense. Uh, I'll say something about Heraclitus a bit later. There's actually something interesting that I've been reading in the Schelling book. Um, so, anyways, desire of desire is the first form of self-consciousness. And the best account I have read about this is from Richard Dean Winfield, who has a nice thing going on about it, about how he says, look, you got to have a way to comprehend that consciousness is not necessarily initially a linguistic construct of ours. It's not a social thing of ours, which we arrive at because we have an what Kant would call a discursive, understanding. Uh, we must be able to ground linguistic articulation in something non-linguistic. Therefore, you must be able to ground recognition not upon a conceptual conscious. Um, no, it's conscious. It's just not a conceptual recognition. It's not me having this linguistic articulation in my mind in which I recognize you and you recognize me. Rather, it's something that literally just happens between us in the fact of what we are. So desire and desire that desires desire recognizes its own kind in another. Uh, and that is the first basis of self-consciousness. That a child who comes to, desire the love of its mother, desire is really desiring the desire of its mother. Children want to be wanted. Parents want to be wanted by their children. So, this desire of desire is something that happens at the most visceral level. And you absolutely need that. You absolutely need that to even get the ground going for the cultural, articulation of that desire in higher orders. Um, and so this notion of desire, you could also call it love. Um, it's very clear that this very notion is absolutely required for any social animal. All social animals desire. And so that's a very interesting thing. So there's a sense in which self-consciousness and love, or desire of desire in a very simplistic sense, is actually very widespread in the animal kingdom. It's not something centered on humans at all. Your dog is self-conscious, your cat is self-conscious, birds are self-conscious to a degree where they engage this relation. All social animals necessarily must be self-conscious to a significant degree. We are just self-conscious to a supreme degree of, a complete reflexivity of that self-consciousness, where we are self-conscious of our own self-consciousness. Whereas animals are not. Animals are conscious of other consciousnesses, but they're not self-conscious in the fully internal sense. But they're aware of their relations to other things. They're aware that other animals are around. They behave certain ways around other animals. And if you have pets or you see any other animals, they have friendships. They have companions. All these other things. So all those things require desire. All those things are instantiations of recognition to a certain degree. And my main interest in desire, I suppose, kind of goes more towards the social side as opposed to the personal sides, which would kind of be what psychoanalysis would work with, the internal forms of desire. Or people like Peterson, this whole thing about come to terms with yourself and blah blah blah. shit like that. It's I think that stuff is true to a significant degree. It's important, but I find my interest more towards the social. And so I think the interesting question is really something that Hegel poses and that very few other people seem to pose, except for classical philosophers, and that is the role of desire in ethics. That this idea that ethics can and only should be duty is completely erroneous and flawed. Nobody can really function that way. You must have a desire, and if you expect people to act ethically out of only duty, just because they recognize their duty, it ain't gonna happen. Uh, you need people to desire to act ethically. So the question is, how do you shape desire? How do you construct a subject that is enculturated in such a way that they desire to act ethically? That's a major question. Although it's a question that's always been solved practically. Nobody really asks this question because we just end up doing it, half-assed and shoddily, but we still do it. Every society ends up regulating its own, notions of the ethical, of the moral, and enculturating its citizens into having a stake within that morality so that they care about being moral. So, insofar as you have property, you care about the morality of property to a large degree. Insofar as, you have a stake in politics, you care about what's going on in politics to a large degree. And insofar as you don't, that's at the point at which, morality doesn't matter to you very much. And insofar as you can get away with certain things, morality, won't matter to you much, especially if you can get away with things systematically. So, who was it? I do think I was reading Westfall's account of this, in which he talks about, well, nowadays, you look at most people, are most people moral? If you ask, are they moral? Absolutely. Well, no. But are they mostly moral? Do they happen to go with what's going on in society? Do they happen to uphold the standards of a social ethic? And the answer is actually yes. That by and large, most people are actually very ethical people, generally. Because if they weren't, even if 10% of the people were not generally moral, our society would fall apart. So that kind of stuff is pretty interesting. Come on. It's also the case that, well, going back, swaying to the personal, because there's really not much to be said about the moral beyond abstractions, and talking about certain concrete things, which I'm not too interested in right now. The fact of the whole desire of desire, particularly as love, its role in the human individual and in their individuation. In my Epoche article, I talk a bit about that, and about how this is something massively important that you can't obviously overlook it. It's a psychological component, and that there is this visceral sense of recognition going on, of desire, and then there's this social sense of recognition going on. And those two things end up working upon each other, such that the initial failure of, say, the love of family is going to be significantly skewing the success of any subsequent capacity to recognize that if, for example, you have a situation in which your parents failed to love you or whatever, but you're stuck with that impinging upon your character. You never worked that, you haven't worked that out. You go on into the rest of your life, and no matter who it is that comes out from the exterior and tries to show you some modicum of care, some modicum of recognition, it hardly matters to you. Like for the most part, it doesn't matter to you at all. And I speak about that from personal experience because that's part of my own lived experience. That you know, insofar as the people who really matter to you, the people you genuinely recognize as truly being the people around you, true individuals that matter to you. Insofar as those people don't recognize you, the recognition of others means jack shit. Your professors may be like, oh, you're so intelligent, you're so smart, neighbors, everybody else, but it doesn't fucking matter to you. So, that social recognition fails to emotionally penetrate, and therefore you find no will, no desire to. Sorry if the wind's there. Sorry about that. So if you fail to have that, obviously you're going to not give a shit, and if you don't give a shit, you're not going to be doing much. But anyways, douchebag. To go back to what you were saying about Heraclitus, I think there's some fragments in which Heraclitus mentions power, and I was reading this Schellingian book, and they mention Heraclitus. They mention how Heraclitus has a metaphysics of power. That's specifically recognized, I think, by Giordano Bruno. Let me know if the wind is too much. It's kind of hard. But yeah, metaphysics of power, being as power. That's definitely something interesting. I think that what is this? So there's also people have called Heraclitus's philosophy metaphysics of war, which is also interesting. Somebody who talks about that, I think, is Giorgiani, who mentions that part of the success of the West in being the colonizers of the world is because the West ends up, having this legacy of a Greek philosophy of war, and that Greece had this because it was between, warring major empires during its existence. Let me step out of the clearings just so the wind isn't too much. But yeah, being as power, that's an interesting idea. Depending on how one means it, I think it works. But yeah, that's generally all I really had to say for my stream, unless anybody has some questions to ask me. Man, that tires out your arm. Christ. All right, seems that no questions. So let's see. Can't get it to focus. Was going to leave it off with a shot of the clouds. Yeah, it's a wonderful view. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave it at some point. There we go. You got a view of clouds. My car has like some kind of leaking issue right now with the antifreeze. Don't know what part is leaking. Doesn't seem to be too major, but I'm gonna have to see about getting that resolved. Because I don't want to be driving around and having the whole thing explode. But all right, thanks for watching. Hopefully you'll find it entertaining. Hopefully you found it somewhat intellectually meaningful.